Hi everybody, going to post a video lecture to cover for the canceled class that we had because of my sick day. I'm going to deal with the church in early medieval Europe and the rise of Christianity across Europe, the spread of Christianization. The dominant religion in early medieval Europe was Christianity, or at least it came to be over a course of 500 years, between about 500 AD, when the early Middle Ages begin, down to 1000 AD when we mark the transition into the High Middle Ages. I'll talk about the spread of Christianity a little later on, but first I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the Christian church during this period and a little bit about the spirituality, what kind of practices were involved in early medieval Christianity. What is this thing that's spreading? We've already spoken about Christianity at one point, originating in the Roman Empire. We saw that it was in many ways a variation on Judaism. If you look at those 6 principles of Judaism, monotheism, universalism, biblicism, legalism or moralism, apocalypticism and messianism, Christianity inherits all of them and continues all of them, but each with its own variation that starts giving it its own character as a distinct religion and not just as one Jewish sect among others. And we saw that in the Roman Empire for the first 300 years or so of its history, Christianity was illegal and persecuted. But then with the Emperor Constantine, you have your first Christian emperor. You're going to continue having Christian Roman emperors pretty much continuously thereafter, and that means you have a transition of Christianity from being a persecuted minority of outsiders to a privileged minority of insiders in the Roman Empire. At the time of Constantine's conversion, the population of the empire might have been maybe 5 or 10% Christian, something like that. Not, enormous numbers. Presumably continuing to increase, and evidently continuing to increase thereafter. It's very difficult to get reliable statistics. In general, by the time the Western Empire breaks up in 500 AD, you could pretty much reliably say that the urban population in the cities of the empire was predominantly Christian. The elites by then had come to be predominantly Christian. The countryside, on the other hand, was not definitively brought over to the new religion. Now, country people didn't have strong religious institutions of their own anymore. The public temples had largely been shut down and so forth. There were no public sacrifices. So you can't really say they're practicing an alternative religion that you could really define either. They're just carrying on with their customs, doing whatever they do. And Christianity gradually starts facing this challenge of imposing its presence or exerting some kind of a presence out in the countryside. Largely does that through the influence of Christian landowners. You have a lot of urban aristocrats who have their sort of home in the city, their townhouse, but then they've also got their estates out in the countryside they get their wealth from. They'll start building chapels on their land. They'll start bringing in priests to sort of tend to their areas, and that'll start influencing the regional population. Monasteries, that we'll talk about later, also spread out in the countryside and have an influence there. So in the sort of 6th and 7th centuries, a lot of what's going on is a process of trying to spread Christianity into the countryside. But the structure of Christianity is this religion. Excuse me. You have 2 distinct kinds of Christian institutions. Okay, 2 different organizational structures existing parallel to each other and interacting with each other. The terminology for them can be a little bit confusing because the words sound like words that we use all the time in English, but they have specialized meanings when we're talking about this historical context. On the one hand, you have what we call the secular church, and on the other hand, you have what we call the regular church. So secular church, regular church. Neither of those words mean what you think they mean. Let me explain what they do mean. When we talk about the secular church in the Middle Ages, that sounds funny. You think the word secular means not religious. That's the way we usually use it in modern times. So how can you have a church that's not religious? Well, that's not what it means in this context. In the early Middle Ages, secular comes from the Latin word seculum that means the world. So the secular church means those church institutions and clergy who are dealing with the rest of the world, okay, who are dealing with all the people who are not clergy, who are not members of the formal institutions. In other words, these are people like your parish priests, right? Your local priests who are baptizing people, teaching, performing funerals, burying people, all this kind of a thing, right? They're sort of dealing with the rest of the world out there. We're dealing with what we call lay people, right? Lay people meaning ordinary people who are not ordained. They're Christians, they're members of the church, but they're not ordained, they're not clergy, they're not religious specialists. The secular churches, clergy are the ones who are dealing with them, performing their baptisms and their rites and all that kind of stuff. So on the one hand, you got the secular church. It has a hierarchical structure. The clergy has a bunch of lower orders, so you don't need to worry too much about them, but sort of doorkeepers and acolytes and subdeacons and people like that. The priests are the people who are on the ground doing the most routine ministries to ordinary people, your baptisms and funerals and such that I was mentioning. And then above the priests and supervising them, you have bishops. The word bishop comes from the Greek word episkopos. So if you're talking about things that have to do with bishops, you'll see the word episcopal. There's a denomination of Christianity today called the Episcopal Church. That's Protestant churches that have bishops. But the bishops are overseers. They're sort of executives. They will have a headquarters church where they have their seat, their throne of authority, so to speak. In Latin, that's a cathedra. So the cathedral church is the main church in the city where the bishop presides and sits on his throne, his seat, his cathedra, and oversees his things from there. And the bishop is responsible for all the Christian activity going on in a territory. His territory is normally going to match up with the administrative districts of the empire. This is all developing after Constantine. It is called a diocese. So you've got a city, you've got the surrounding countryside with the small villages and farms and things. The bishop is in the cathedral church in the city at the center of it all, and he's overseeing the priests who are staffing the cathedral and the various other churches and chapels around the area, and he's sort of in charge of the whole thing. The bishops tend to be sort of very influential executive type of figures, right? They've got a lot of land, they've got a lot of wealth, buildings, staff, people they're overseeing. They tend to be highly educated. By the time you get to the end of the 4th century and getting into the 5th and 6th centuries, and certainly through the early Middle Ages, they tend to get recruited from the aristocracy. Right? These are noblemen, these are highly educated people from wealthy families taking over these positions, and they're able to kind of rub shoulders with powerful nobles, both because of their office as bishop and also because of their birth, what family they come from, in the wealthy house. So very powerful figures. The wealthy families themselves see how powerful the bishops in their cathedrals are and how much wealth and influence there is in them, and so they see this as something they want to invest in. They will very often be donors to the major churches, and they will often send at least some of their sons, not uncommonly, excuse me, to the cathedral to be educated there. Remember, the schools are starting to fade away, so they'll send one of their children to go be educated in the cathedral, start rising through the ranks of the clergy, become a priest, and then there's kind of an expectation when the old bishop dies, it's going to be one of the priests who came from a major noble donor family is probably going to get the most attention when the time comes to choose who the next bishop is going to be. So you get this really close generation to generation relationship between the powerful aristocratic families on the one hand and the churches on the other. One bishop towards the end of the 6th century, Gregory of Tours, he writes a book of histories, and at one point he's talking about his own career, and he says, of the last 24 bishops of Tours, ever since the beginning, 16 of them were related to him somehow, had come from his family, his uncles and in-laws and, people like that. So you can sort of see there where his family just really had a lock on this cathedral and really were able to make sure that their people got appointed bishop on a regular basis. Another feature of the secular church, and particularly the bishops, is that as the secular administration of government is fading away, we talked about that as one of the results of the end of the Roman Empire in the West, as the literate secular bureaucracy is kind of fading out and withering away and sort of dying out from attrition, the bishops very often wind up stepping into that role in terms of public leadership and community leadership. They're advising kings very often. Them and their staff are doing a lot of the composing letters and composing all the written texts, the documentation of government the kings need. They are stepping into roles in their local cities as sort of community leaders and spokesmen. If the king is angry at a city because of something political, then the bishop will often be the spokesman for the city who will defend it and advocate for it. If the city faces a crisis, if there's a famine, if they've been attacked and people have been carried off into captivity or into slavery, there's a flood or an enemy army approaching, you'll often find the bishop stepping in to be the person who's going to handle it. He's going to oversee the walls getting rebuilt or getting reinforced. He's going to be ransoming people from captivity or from slavery if they got captured in a war. He's going to be buying food to bring in for poor relief and hunger relief if there's a famine going on, things like that. So bishops really play a very important public role in these cities. So that's the secular church, right? The worldly church. Hierarchy of priests and bishops with the cathedral at the center of it all. The city with the cathedral is called the bishop's see, just like see spot run. It's from a Latin word, another word for seat, just like cathedra means a throne. The see is his seat. So the city where the bishop's cathedral is his see, and the territory around it is his diocese, and he's got all his priests there that he's overseeing. Okay, so that's one side. On the other side, you have church institutions that are called the regular church. And once again, regular doesn't just mean ordinary or normal. It comes from the same, the word regula, that means rule, the same as we get the sense of regulated or regulations. And the idea is that these are institutions that operate under strict rules that dictate their way of life. Okay, that specify, here are all the requirements and obligations and restrictions of living this religious way of life. When medieval sources talk about someone being religious, they often don't mean simply that they believe in God or go to church. They mean that they are under these kinds of rules. They're under a vow that commits them to a specifically religious type of life. These are your monks and your nuns, basically, right? Your monks and your nuns who are under rules, under vows, and are going to be living this regulated religious life. Living in monasteries and nunneries, obviously. There's a number of different kinds. The whole phenomenon of monasticism of the regular church originates in the Eastern Mediterranean area, right about the time of Constantine's conversion, back around the beginning of the 4th century. Places like Egypt and Syria and Palestine, these sort of Middle Eastern provinces that are still part of the Roman Empire. And what had originally been going on there was basically, remember, the church had been a church of martyrs, or the martyrs were the heroes of the church. They were the holy men, the particular men and women, the people who really were marked out for their sanctity and that you knew had forsaken the world and turned their back on this life in order to devote themselves to faith and to heaven and to preparing themselves for the next life. And martyrdom was a clear proof of that. But the question is, once Christianity is no longer being persecuted, then what do you do, right? What does it mean to forsake the world and devote yourself to heaven if it's not going to mean getting yourself martyred? How do you go about doing that? And monasticism is the answer to that. If nobody's going to martyr you, in a sense, you martyr yourself. That's overstating a little bit, but you're going to live a life of discipline. You're going to live a life of self-denial. It's called asceticism, A-S-C-E-T-I-S-M, asceticism. This life of self-denial, of discipline, where the basic idea is that, just like the ancient Greeks did, you see yourself being composed of body and soul. The passions of the body, just like the Greeks thought with arete, the passions of the body are a danger to the soul, not just to the rational mind's ability to control your life the way the ancient Greeks thought about it, but now in a Christian context, it's a danger to your actual salvation. Right, passions of the body, these start becoming, sloth, lust, gluttony, all these 7 deadly sins type of things. So bodily passions are still something you need to worry about or need to control, and even more strongly than the ancient Greeks had thought, something you need to deny, right? Something you need to sort of learn to have the soul and the mind have absolute control over and deny in order to set yourself free for a higher spiritual life and to draw yourself closer to heaven. right? So once upon a time, you could deny the body by allowing it to be killed, the way that Perpetua had done, but now you're going to have more of a long-term life of self-denial, life of self-discipline, in order to be able to attain that same goal of leaving the world and entering heaven. So martyrdom is no longer an option. You're going to start pursuing monasticism instead. So asceticism is going to mean deny your body's gluttony, its urge to eat, and so you'll practice fasting to a strong degree. You're going to be facing your body's lust, and so you're going to deny that and practice celibacy. Your body wants to rest and be comfortable, so you're going to stay up all night at a prayer vigil, and you're going to sleep on hard rocks rather than a nice comfortable bed, this kind of thing. All these acts of self-denial and self-deprivation in order to focus your soul more strongly on prayer and the study of holy scriptures and meditation and these kinds of things that will bring your soul closer to heaven. St. Anthony of Egypt was a famous early exemplar of this way of life. He went out of the fertile regions of Egypt, went into the desert, first lived in a cell on the fringe of the desert, then went deeper in. He lived among tombs for a while, and then he went to a mountain even further afield, more and more isolated from human society. Gained a reputation as a holy man who did battle with demons out in the wilderness, was visited by angels, had a wisdom far beyond his education. He could answer any question and have this, sort of special spiritual insight. So sort of this legendary, colossal kind of a figure that very much impressed all kinds of people with his sanctity. You got other kinds, and by the way, Antony's way of life, sort of going out solitary into the wilderness, this becomes the model of the hermit life, which is one version of the regular church, right? The sort of solitary individual in the wilderness, theoretically solitary. Often they actually would have companions. So the way of the hermit, that was one way you could do things. You had some spectacular, extravagant examples of people doing this in other areas. Something that became popular in Syria was if you could find an old ruined building or an old ruined pagan temple that had some pillars still standing, you'd put up a ladder and climb up on top of one of the pillars and live on top of the pillar for years and years and years, sort of sitting up there. Rain and the sun would beat down on you. People would raise food up to you on a rope. But just sort of be up there exposed to the elements, living your life of prayer and denial, and obviously not getting much to eat, not having sex, not being very comfortable. Sort of this great dramatic example of this ascetic, kind of hermit life that people would live. So this is this individual model. However, as an ideal of religious life in Christianity, the way of the hermit does have a bit of a problem to it, and that's that, as we mentioned, among the Christian moral scheme, love is supposed to be a central virtue, right? Not enough just to be self-controlled or self-denying. You're supposed to be loving towards your neighbor and towards people, and it raises the question, how are you going to do that if you don't have anybody around, right? If you're off by yourself in the desert, how do you love anybody if there's nobody around for you to love? So what starts becoming the more popular form of the ascetic life starts becoming the collective ascetic life. It's called cenobiticism. We don't need to worry too much about that word, but that means common life, shared life. In other words, people who are undertaking this vows and wanting to practice this life of self-deprivation, spirituality, will gather together in communities. You'll have places where maybe there's a bunch of caves in the cliffside, and they're all kind of, each guy has his own cave, and they come together for meals. They do eat something. They're not fasting all the time, obviously. They have to live. Come together for meals, come together for worship services, things like that, and it will do that. And eventually this grows into the model of the monastery, where you'll get an actual institution, usually walled off, so people can be isolated from the world, but it's got dormitories and a dining hall and a chapel and all these necessities of what they need to do to function together as a community. In Europe, one of the major figures influencing the growth of this is a figure in the 6th century, St. Benedict. You've got his rule to read, and maybe we'll get a chance to discuss the rule a little bit. But Benedict's rule kind of winds up becoming the standard framework for how to run a monastery. And you can see in there all the various functions and different officers in the way of life. They've got a routine cycle of services in which they are chanting their way through the entire book of Psalms, as well as from the Bible, as well as additional prayers and readings and things like that. So quite a lot going on in this life. In a monastery, the main, you've got all the monks, obviously. Somebody needs to be in charge, and the title of the person in charge of the monastery is normally an abbot. Abbot, the word comes from Middle Eastern languages. It means father, so he's just a father figure. And you get this very Roman kind of patriarchal sense around the abbot of the monastery as the father of all of his monks. Guiding them and leading them and disciplining them, can be a very stern kind of a figure, but also supposed to be a loving figure in lots of ways. So this is the regular church, right? The church under a regula, a rule, that dictates their way of life, tells you need to be obedient to the abbot, you need to practice poverty, you need to practice chastity, you need to have this life of asceticism, and self-denial, and a life in which you are, conversely, devoting yourself to spiritual pursuits, to the study of scripture, to prayer, and so forth. Okay, so that's the institutional structure of the church. You get the secular church with its priests and its bishops presiding over dioceses, territorially dealing with the population at large, and then you get your regular church, your monasteries and your hermits. On the other hand, monasteries with these collective communities, and then hermits, some of them out individually on their own in the wilderness, all doing their thing in order to pursue their own kind of salvation. As far as the development of Christianity as a religion and Christian practices, there were a few developments coming along over the course of the early Middle Ages from 500 to 1000 that are significant, will be very influential going on. One of them is the rise of the penitential system. Okay, the penitential system. Penitence is dealing with what happens when people sin. Right? Christianity is a moralistic religion. It's a religion that has, commandments and rules, moral decrees that people ought to follow. Love God, the Lord your God, love your neighbor, right on down to, the Ten Commandments and so forth. But Christianity also has an idea of human sin, right? People break these rules and they need to be forgiven, and so you repent of your sin, you ask God for forgiveness, and that's well and good. Penitence arises from the idea that it's well and good to say you repent of your sins and God forgives them, but if you've really repented of the sin, doesn't that mean you're going to do something to make up for it? Right? It's not enough to sort of just say the words, I repent, and then you're done. You get this kind of sensibility that a truly penitent person ought to do something to change themselves, and maybe if they can change what they've done. Now, if you've committed a wrong against somebody, of course you make good on what you've done to them if you've stolen from them or something. But a lot of sins are sins that are just against God. There's no human victim. They're, what we would call victimless crimes. You can't really pay God back. God, already has everything you need. So what can you do? And the answer tends to be that you need to do something to make up. So it's often going to take an ascetic kind of a form. In the Roman period, you would have penitence was very public. It was only for people who had done really extravagantly bad things. They'd stolen, they'd committed adultery, they'd murdered somebody, things like that. And that would get you put in the order of penitence, which meant you had to sit at the back of the church. You wouldn't be allowed to take communion. It was kind of a bit humiliating to be stuck back there. You weren't supposed to engage in sexual activity if you were married. Just sort of all these, restrictions back there in the order of penitence, and you wouldn't get communion until you're on your deathbed, and that kind of gave you your final forgiveness and sent you on. But what starts happening in the early Middle Ages, starting off in monasteries, and especially starting off in Ireland, once Christianity spreads to Ireland, is the idea that penitence shouldn't just be for big, grand, massive sins like, theft and adultery and murder, but there's all these little sins people do that makes their souls impure over the course of a week or a day or whatever, and they need to do something about that too. So you get this kind of retail penance instead of the wholesale, large-scale penance of the old public penances. You get a practice starting out in Irish monasteries where one monk will confess to another monk. Maybe he had some bad thoughts, or maybe he didn't say the prayers, all the prayers he was supposed to say, or it had, things like that. And in various little kinds of ways had violated the standards of righteousness he was trying to live by. And then the other monk or the abbot of the monastery would give him little penances. Okay, well, go say some extra prayers, or, go fast for a couple of days, or, do something else to kind of, make up for this and purify yourself. The monasteries, although theoretically they're shut away from the world, they do in fact interact with people outside, and this starts becoming a form of spirituality that monks are teaching people outside the monasteries to start doing. People who are patrons of the monastery, donors to the monastery, will start coming to the monks and confessing their sins and having penances given to them. And you get this phenomenon where Irish monks start traveling elsewhere in Europe about the end of the 6th and through the 7th and 8th centuries, and they bring these ideas with them. So with it, this idea of confessing your sins, even your little sins that happen on a daily basis to someone. Eventually it winds up being a priest, although initially it doesn't have to be, but someone with some kind of religious standing, confessing your sins and getting a penance that you're going to go and, say some extra prayers or give some to some charity, practice some form of self-denial for a while to kind of make up for it. This starts becoming a lot of the routine daily religious activity of highly devout people in this world. So that's sort of a growing feature of Christianity in the period. Another thing, which is a growing feature of Christianity in the early Middle Ages, is what we call the cult of saints. Cult here does not mean sort of a esoteric sect going off into the wilderness to be sort of bizarre and different from the rest of society. Cult just means a system of beliefs and practices and ideas and stories surrounding the veneration of a supernatural figure. So in this case, you get this idea. It goes back to the martyrs from the era when Christianity was illegal. One thing about martyrs is that there's no doubt in anyone's mind this person is in heaven, right? We saw Perpetua's visions, and she sort of gets these dreams showing her that she's going to be going to heaven because of the death that she's going to undergo. So when surviving Christians think of the martyrs, they think these are people who have gone before us and already in heaven, and we can be sure of that because of the way they died, keeping their faith. So the martyrs are in heaven, but at the same time, Christianity also has another belief, which makes this interesting, which is a belief in the resurrection of the body. Right? Christianity does not teach that salvation is your soul leaving your body to go off in a disembodied heaven somewhere and sort of float around on clouds. Christianity teaches a resurrection of the body. That's its apocalypticism, that at the end of time, when the apocalypse comes, the bodies will come back to life, the souls will be reunited with their bodies, and people will be restored to a eternal life as body and soul together, united and purified and sanctified. So what does this mean about the body of a martyr, right? It means that the body of a martyr is still that person's body, right? Their soul has left it for the time being to go be with God in heaven, but that's not a permanent situation. The body still belongs to the martyr, right? It's waiting for the resurrection. It's asleep waiting to get woken up. Sometimes you'll even get stories that their bodies don't decay, that they sort of stay healthy and just looking like they're sleeping and smelling sweet and not rotting away in their tombs. So the body is still linked to the soul that's gone to heaven and is in the presence of God. And that means the place where the body is kind of a bridgehead linking you to heaven, right? It's a physical place you can go where you're closer to heaven than you would be if you were anyplace else, right? Because the body of the saint, the body of the martyr, is connected to the soul of the saint, which is in heaven. They don't get totally detached. They still belong to each other. And so the tombs of saints become places that people want to visit, right? If you go to the tomb of a saint, maybe you're suffering from an illness, maybe you're barren and you want a baby, something like that. If you go to the tomb of the saint and you pray there, then the saint will hear you. You're in a place where those prayers are more likely to get answered. You're in a place where miracles are going to happen. And you actually get all kinds of miracle stories getting told about things happening at the tombs of saints. So the martyrs turn into saints, and this veneration of saints, telling stories about their martyrdoms, telling stories about their holy lives, telling stories about the miracles that happen to people at their tombs. This all starts to be this cult of saints, this sort of variety of practices. The day of the saint's martyrdom becomes a saint's day, becomes a feast day that you're going to have as a holiday, things like that. So the rise of the cult of saints becomes very important. And with it, the rise of relics of saints. Relics are the bodily remains of saints. Initially, you go to the tomb where the saint is buried. That's sort of a natural thing to do. But as Christianity is spreading, you're getting new chapels being created out in the countryside. People want to have some kind of a saintly presence out there as well. And when you think about this idea of the resurrection of the body, well, some people are Christian believers and you're sure they're going to heaven, but their body isn't all in one piece. They got eaten by wild animals in the arena. Or some people may have been believers, maybe they weren't martyred, but They drowned at sea and fish ate their body and stuff like that. So where's the body now that's going to get resurrected? Well, there's a confidence that God will be able to take care of all that, and God will be able to take all the parts of the body, wherever it was or however it got separated out, and will somehow be able to put it all back together and re-resurrect it, or put new form to it or something. There's going to be some way that this will all work out. What that means, as far as the body of a martyr that people are venerating, is that you don't have to keep all the physical remains in one place, right? Stories are told about, like I said, bodies of martyrs that don't decay, but of course, in reality, you open up the tombs of your average martyr, and most of them you find a skeleton inside, not a complete whole body. You have a skeleton inside of all these separate bones, and it becomes possible, acceptable, even desirable to remove the separate bones and send them out as gifts to different churches in different areas so they can all have the presence of the saint in their church as well. You don't have to go to the tomb of the saint can come to you, the saint can come to lots of places. And you'll find a practice where you'll have churches and chapels all over Europe that have, a skull from this saint or a bone from that saint or something like that. You'll also find contact relics. Contact relic is not part of the physical remains of the saint, but something that was in contact with the physical remains of the saint. An article of clothing that they wore, chains that they were placed on them when they were in prison. Dust off the cover of the tomb will count as a contact relic. So there's all these kind of ways where people are trying to get the presence of the holy dead in their around. Very, very different sensibility than anything that had existed in the ancient world. And a major preoccupation. You see people not just going to church to pray to God or to Jesus Christ, but the sort of idea of you've got this community of patrons, you remember that Roman idea of patronage, these sort of people who are advocating for you, people who have power and influence who are going to be on your side. The saints start becoming your patrons that you can appeal to, and you've got their relics in your local church, or maybe even a little piece of one that you can carry around with yourself, and that's going to be a piece of it. So, going on pilgrimages to saints' tombs can itself be a kind of a penance you could do. Travel is difficult and dangerous and expensive, so a holy act like going to that can be a way to kind of purify your soul as well if you're assigned a penance for something you did. So this is shaping a lot of medieval Christian spirituality and practice. A lot going on around penitence and concern about dealing with sin in this way, and a lot going on in terms of in terms of growth of the cult of saints and the way people are finding that as a way that they're going to try to approach the divine. Sorry. The cold that made me cancel class is still lingering with me a little bit, so I apologize. Okay. So that's on sort of the structure of Christianity in this area, in early medieval Europe. The last thing to talk about is the spread of Christianity. I started off alluding to it a little bit, but I'm going to talk about it in more detail. If you were to lay out on a map where Christianity, is dominant in, say, the year 500, right, about the generation that the Roman Empire broke up, you would find it was almost exclusively located within the frontiers of the Roman Empire. There's a couple of pockets, Armenia, Georgia, Ethiopia, Ireland, outside of the Roman Empire where Christianity had started to spread out beyond those frontiers, but for the most part, Christianity was a Roman thing. And remember that for the last couple hundred years of the Western Roman Empire, Christianity was the religion of emperors, and people remember that. When they look back to the Roman Empire, they don't remember Caesar Augustus or Julius Caesar or anything. They remember Constantine. They remember Theodosius and Justinian, these Christian emperors. So Christianity was a Roman thing in a big way. And it was a Mediterranean thing because the Roman Empire is around the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, fast forward to a map 500 years later, and map out where are the areas where Christianity is the dominant religion. Excuse me. And you're going to find a somewhat different map. The northern shore of Africa and the Middle East, areas that had been part of the Roman Empire and had been heartlands of Christianity, very predominantly Christian areas, those are off the map now. Islam, which I think we mentioned briefly in an earlier class, Islam has arisen to kind of taken over those areas as the new dominant religion. Conquered them over the course of the 7th and 8th centuries, and then did not force people to convert, but over the next couple of hundred years, you get a cultural shift where people gradually start to take on the religion of the conquerors. so that by the time you're at about 900, 1000 AD or so, most of northern Africa and the Middle East has become predominantly Muslim in population. Okay. Um, Look on the other side of the Mediterranean, on the northern side, and Europe, on the other hand. In 500, Christianity had only been contained pretty much within the frontiers of the Roman Empire. By the time you get to 1000, it spread across most of the rest of Europe. Scandinavia, Germany, Hungary, Poland, Russia, all the Slavic lands in the east. Christianity by the year 1000 has been adopted, excuse me, all over Europe. There's a few pockets along the Baltic Sea, Finland, Lithuania, places like that, a bit of northern Germany. Um, a few areas where there are pockets of paganism holding out, where people are still adhering to their traditional religions and who have not yet adopted Christianity. But for the most part, Christianity has become the common denominator religion dominating across most of Europe. So between 500 and 1001 AD, you have this massive shift in cultural history, massive shift in religious history, where Christianity as a world religion goes from being a Mediterranean thing, still kind of anchored in the Middle East, to becoming a European thing, right? The Middle East is going its own path. That's why in this course, we started with the Middle East, but we're not really continuing with it. The Middle East becomes part of Islamic civilization and is going to have its own direction there, whereas Western civilization is largely going to get defined around Europe and the zone of Christendom. Okay. And again, that's not claiming superiority for one or the other or anything like that. It's just, these become quite distinct civilizations going forward that way. So you have the spread of Christianity over 500 years. Long, gradual process. Doesn't happen instantly. It doesn't happen hugely dramatically, really. It's a steady, steady move eastwards and northwards. So the question is, what are the dynamics? What makes this happen? Part of it is the spread of monasticism. Monasticism plays an important role because in the Roman Empire, Christianity had been a largely urban phenomenon. It had spread along the network of cities, city to city to city, following trade, following government officials who converted their slaves and their servants who go with them, things like that. So Roman Christianity had largely been an urban thing. The countryside, not terribly heavily Christianized, but partly through the ruralization of the population, aristocrats going out to live in the countryside more and not bothering with the cities, and partly because of monasticism, where the monasteries don't want to be in the cities. They want to be out isolated away from the world, hermits going off in the forest. So they're going out into the countryside and they're starting to have an influence on the rural population. There's a certain cultural phenomenon where the image of the person who's been touched by the divine, the person who's not quite a part of ordinary society, that tends to cut across religious lines. Asceticism, someone who is refusing to eat like normal people, refusing to get married and have sex and have children like normal people, someone who is spending their time devoting their mind to focusing on a supernatural entity. People recognize that as holiness everywhere and hope for favor, for benefits, for miracles from holy men, no matter what their own religion is. That sort of cuts across multiple religions. And so hermits, Christian hermits showing up in wilderness areas in Europe sort of starts influencing the rural populations to go to them for advice and therefore listening to their sermons and coming under their influence and coming to be adopting their religion, quite voluntarily, generally, really. Just sort of the part of the ongoing dynamic of seeking out the holy and the people who are able to give it to you in order to give you some hope of coping with the difficulties of the world. There's a certain amount of just cultural diffusion going on. There's no hard and sharp boundary between what's Christian pagan. You get people intermarrying, you get people engaging in trade, you get people buying land and becoming neighbors and things like that. And there seems to be a lot that's not really documented. You only sort of realize it must have been going on when later on a churchman shows up somewhere to go and build a church where there never had been a church before, and he's got people there. Excuse me. Excuse me. Wow. Okay, that was a big one. He's got people there who want to donate to it and become a member of it and become involved with it already. He doesn't need to convert them. They're already somehow in place. That suggests cultural diffusion, just spreading geographically Christianity beyond the old Roman frontiers, territory to territory to territory. As rulers, the Germanic kings convert to Christianity. You do get episodes where Christianity will be imposed by force, and you see that happening in some areas as well. We'll talk about Charlemagne when we're back in class next week. He's the most dramatic example of this. Charlemagne allies himself very closely with the church. In certain of his wars of conquest, when he's dealing with pagan peoples, the Saxons, most notably in northern Germany, Charlemagne will sometimes literally march them down to the river at spear point to get baptized, sort of enforcing Christianity, by, sword and fire. That's not normal. And even within Charlemagne's lifetime, after the Saxon Wars, when he conquers another pagan people, the Avars, you have letters from his advisors, his church advisors, saying, let's not do with these people what we did with the Saxons. Let's do this the right way around and teach them rather than just, convert them by force. But still, it does happen in some areas. King Olaf in Norway is another example. He converts to Christianity, and as he's consolidating his kingdom, imposes Christianity on rebel subjects in some cases. So sort of, again, a violent imposition of Christianity there. That's part of the story, not the whole story, not the norm, but it does happen in certain areas. Probably the single most important dynamic is a dynamic associated with what we call Christianity being a prestige religion. Okay, Christianity is a prestige religion. And you see this in other parts of the world with other religions as well. Buddhism spreads in Asia because of it. Things like that. The idea to a prestige religion is when you have different cultures in contact with their different religions, and there's a differential in status or prestige between them, right? One culture can clearly demonstrate greater wealth, greater complexity, greater sophistication. And people in the other culture, often the leadership in the other culture, wants to appropriate that, right? They want to sort of tap into these resources that the neighboring culture has. So if you imagine yourself as a Norse or Slavic or something, a pagan chieftain, and maybe you go off on a raid or you go off on a trading expedition or something and you go visit Christian lands, you go into a Christian city, and they've got this huge stone building with these windows in it and, stained glass going on. And you go inside and there's all these rows of people in silk robes with these golden cups and chalices and vessels and things going on. And they're chanting in this language. And they've got this thing made out of parchment, made out of animal skins with these markings all over it, and they look at the markings and they can speak words that were first spoken by people thousands, hundreds or thousands of years beforehand, sort of magically preserved on the animal skins. There's incense, there's extraordinary smells from all over. There's this music that's like nothing you've ever heard echoing through the building. There's just all this amazing stuff going on. And then you go home to your own, village back in Norway, and you've got the holy tree. Right? And okay, it's a pretty cool tree, but doesn't have all this other stuff. That sort of gets across the way a prestige religion works. If you are a Norse chieftain and you want to be a king, like the king of the Franks is a king, or like the Anglo-Saxon kings are kings, those guys, wow, they've really got this amazing stuff going on there. You want to have the stuff that they have. Right? You want to get all that and bring it over for your people. And so you're going to send a messenger and say, hey, can we get this baptism thing? Can you send some of those priest guys? Can you send some, some architects and some choir masters and teach us how to sing, that chants? And you're going to start donating and set it up and invite all this stuff in and set it up, because that's a way that you're going to build up your own prestige. Right? You want to be part of that sophisticated, glamorous world that you see out there, because that's going to give you the stature to start, dealing with those Christian kings as their equal. You don't want them to look down on you as a barbarian. You want to say, hey, I'm part of your civilization too, and you should respect me. So Christianity becomes a prestige religion. It had been the religion of emperors for a long time. It's got all this paraphernalia that's very impressive. Literacy is an awfully big deal. It's carrying that with it as it goes out into cultures that had not previously been literate. And so Christianity as a prestige religion starts influencing people very, very strongly. And that's probably the single biggest dynamic in this transformation we're talking about between 500 and 1000, this deliberate adoption and transfer and invitation of Christian leadership and priests on the terms of the local populations doing the inviting, wanting to appropriate it, willing to convert in order to get these various benefits. Now, of course, there's also some who are, genuinely, sincerely converted by the Christian message. That's always a factor, but that's not necessarily a factor we think of as an historical variable. When we see a large-scale population shift in religion, it usually has to do with more worldly kinds of reasons, and here it seems to be the prestige religion dynamic going on, alongside the various other dynamics that I also mentioned. They're all playing a role in various combinations depending on where exactly you look. Okay, so that's a look at the church side of the equation. We talked about the warrior nobility, the secular nobility in class last time. Now we sort of see the church, major supporters of the kings, major leadership group in these societies, very powerful and hierarchical group of people, both on the secular side and on the monastic side, each sort of contributing to developing this new, distinct medieval Christian culture. One last thing that's important once you get all this sort of established by the year 1000. In Europe, not so much on the Eastern Mediterranean and the Byzantine side of things, but when you get Christianity spreading, the tendency is not to translate the language. The tendency is to keep using the Roman alphabet and to keep using the Latin language as they go with them. That's very different from the Eastern Mediterranean, where when you go to the Russians, you'll come up with a new alphabet and you'll start translating everything into Russian. You go to the Armenians and you come up with an Armenian alphabet and you translate everything into Armenian and so forth. In Europe, the churchmen, for whatever reason, decide not to go that route, and instead of coming up with a new translations of texts into the local languages and new alphabets to match those languages, they bring the Roman alphabet with them everywhere they go. They bring the Latin language with them wherever they go. And the result of that, local languages will continue. You have people speaking English and Irish Gaelic and Polish and Norse and so on and so forth in their various areas. But Latin becomes the church language, and since the church is carrying literacy and education with it, it becomes the language of education as well, the language of scholarship and intellectual life. And so you get this sort of two-tier culture in some ways of, people who can speak Latin and people who can't. That's going to become a major cultural divide in some ways, or certain elitism. There is oral translation, of course. If someone's giving a sermon to convert people or whatever, to teach them, about baptism or whatever it is, or penitence or whatever they're doing, they're going to have a book in Latin and they're going to translate it over into their mother tongue for people to understand. But they're not writing that down in the mother tongue. That's the difference with the literate culture. To be able to read means to be able to read Latin. Right? There's hardly any writing going on in people's local languages. So on the one hand, you create this two-tier culture, right, between the Latin-speaking church and educated people on the one hand, and the non-Latin-speaking, non-literate local population with local languages. But it also means that education and being a member of the clergy takes on this kind of international quality, right? The church becomes this international institution where it's speaking a language that is nobody's native tongue anymore. The Latin language is evolving into Romance languages, and written Latin is coming to be a dead language. So you got this language which is sort of international, doesn't really belong to any one ethnicity or people from any one place. Nobody learns Latin at their mother's knee. Everybody learns it at school. And the church itself, spread all across Europe, you wind up with this fascinating international situation where you could travel anywhere in Europe and encounter all these different cultures, all these different languages, but religion is always going to be a common denominator where things are going to be recognizable. They may have some different saints, they may celebrate some different feast days than you do back home, but there's going to be a mass, there's going to be a fairly recognizable, priests and bishops and, the whole structure. You're going to know what's going on. And you're going to be able to communicate. If you're a member of the clergy, you're going to be able to communicate with other clergy because you're all speaking this international language, Latin. And so because of that, you could have somebody who maybe is born in Poland and goes into the priesthood and winds up going to Germany for school, and then they go down to Italy and become a bishop or something like that. There's sort of these very international careers by the time you get to the 900s, the 1000s. People moving all over the place on a totally international basis, not having to be rooted in any one local culture. And that's a pretty major development too, that sort of ties the various European kingdoms together politically divided, but having this sort of cultural umbrella provided by religion and by the church and education, which is very, very important. Okay, so I think that's long enough. Sorry about the coughing fits. Still finishing stages of recuperating from this flu. But I hope that was helpful, and I will see you all back in class when we'll move on to talk about Charlemagne himself. Thank you.